The work detail. The morning mist clung to the French countryside like a whisper of forgotten battles. Klaus Schneider adjusted the worn collar of his prison uniform and fell into line with the other German POWs as they shuffled toward the waiting trucks. It was October 1945, 6 months since the war had ended, and Klaus had grown accustomed to the routine of captivity. Wake before dawn, eat thin porridge, work until your hands bled, sleep on straw mattresses that smelled of mildew and defeat. "Where are we going today?" whispered Hans, a former Panzer commander who had lost his entire crew in the Ardennes. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp enough to cut bread. "Some old general's farm," Klaus replied, keeping his voice low. The French guards were less brutal than the Americans, but they had their limits. "Repair work. The barn is apparently falling apart." The truck rumbled through narrow country roads, past fields that were slowly returning to cultivation. Klaus watched the landscape roll by, remembering when his unit had marched through similar terrain in 1940, when victory seemed inevitable and the Reich stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. Now those dreams lay in ruins, crushed under the weight of their own ambitions. General Auguste Beaumont's estate appeared over a hill, a stone manor house flanked by outbuildings that had seen better days. The barn in question stood at the edge of the property, its weathered boards leaning at precarious angles, the roof sagging like the shoulders of an old soldier. Klaus could see immediately that this would be more than a day's work. The general himself emerged from the manor house as they arrived. He was in his 70s, Klaus guessed, with a thick white mustache and eyes that had witnessed more than one war. He walked with a cane, but carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. The French lieutenant in charge of the work detail saluted crisply. "General Beaumont, the workers have arrived." "Good, good," the old man said, his voice rough as gravel. "The barn is a disgrace. My wife would have been mortified to see it in such condition." His eyes swept over the German prisoners with neither hatred nor pity, simply assessment. "The materials are already inside. You will reinforce the walls, replace rotten boards, and repair the roof structure. My farm manager will supervise." Klaus and 15 other prisoners were led to the barn. The doors were massive, easily 12 feet tall, reinforced with iron bands that had oxidized to a rust-red patina. When the farm manager, a thick-set man named Pierre, pulled them open, the hinges screamed in protest. The interior was dim, thick with dust motes dancing in shafts of light that pierced through gaps in the walls. Klaus's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the usual barn detritus. Old farm equipment, coils of rope, wooden crates stacked against the walls. But there was something else, shapes covered by heavy canvas tarps that seemed too large, too angular to be mere farming machinery. "You will work carefully," Pierre instructed in heavily accented German. "Do not disturb the general's property. You are here to fix the barn, nothing more." As the prisoners began unloading lumber and tools, Klaus found himself drawn to those covered shapes. They were positioned in the back third of the barn, 3 massive forms that stood at least 8 feet tall. The tarps were secured with rope, tied and knotted with military precision. "What do you think is under there?" Hans murmured, appearing at Klaus's elbow. "Farm equipment," Klaus said automatically, but doubt not at him. The shapes were too regular, too purposeful. And why cover farm equipment so carefully? The day's work began in earnest. Klaus hammered nails, sawed boards, and tried to ignore the covered shapes that seemed to watch from the shadows. But curiosity, he knew, was a persistent companion. Before this work detail was finished, he would discover what General Beaumont kept hidden in his barn. By evening, Klaus's hands were blistered and his back ached, but his mind raced with questions. As they loaded back onto the trucks, he noticed the general standing at the manor window, silhouetted against the golden light within, watching them depart with an expression Klaus couldn't decipher. Suspicions. 3 days into the repair work, Klaus's suspicions had crystallized into near certainty. The covered shapes weren't farm equipment. The dimensions were all wrong, and on the second day, when moving a stack of lumber, he had inadvertently brushed against one of the tarps. The surface underneath was cold, hard metallic. The other prisoners had noticed too. Conversations grew more animated during the brief lunch breaks when Pierre disappeared into the manor house. Werner, a former infantry sergeant, spoke what they were all thinking. Those are military vehicles. Has to be. Look at the size, the spacing. 3 of them, identical dimensions. Trucks, suggested Otto, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own hypothesis. No, Hans said firmly. His experience with armored units made him the unofficial expert. Too wide for trucks. Too tall. The way they're positioned, the ground clearance. He trailed off, shaking his head. But it can't be. Can't be what? Klaus pressed. Hans looked around, ensuring the French guards were out of earshot. Tanks. I think the old general has 3 tanks hidden in his barn. The word hung in the air like cordite smoke. Tanks. It seemed impossible, absurd even. Why would a retired French general have tanks hidden on his property? And more importantly, what kind of tanks? That's insane, Otto said. The Allies collected all military equipment after the armistice. Everything was supposed to be catalogued, destroyed, or redistributed. Supposed to be, Klaus echoed. But we're talking about a French general, not just any officer. Look at this estate, the way the lieutenant treats him. Beaumont has influence, connections, maybe enough to keep certain items unofficial. That afternoon, Klaus volunteered to work in the back section of the barn, where the covered vehicle stood. He needed a closer look. Pierre had grown more relaxed as the days passed, and the French guards were often distracted, smoking cigarettes by the barn entrance and discussing local gossip. Working on replacing a support beam, Klaus maneuvered himself beside the nearest covered shape. His heart pounded as he pretended to measure a piece of wood while his free hand reached out to the tarp's edge. The canvas was thick, military grade. His fingers found the rope and he tugged gently, creating a small gap. What he saw made his breath catch. Track links. Unmistakable, weathered track links from a tank's treads. He quickly released the tarp, but the image was burned into his mind. Hans had been right. Find something interesting, prisoner. Klaus spun to find General Beaumont standing behind him, leaning on his cane. The old man's expression was unreadable, but his eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. Non, mon general, Klaus stammered in broken French. Just measuring. Beaumont studied him for a long moment. You were a soldier, yes? I can always tell. The way you move, the way you assess your surroundings. What were you? Infantry. Panzer Grenadier, Klaus admitted, unsure why he was being honest. Ah, the general nodded slowly. You rode with the tanks. Then you understand their beauty, their power. He glanced toward the covered shapes. And their history. Klaus didn't know how to respond. Was this a trap? Would the general report his snooping to the guards? Instead, Beaumont smiled faintly. Continue your work, soldier. The barn needs many repairs. You will be here for several more weeks, I think. He turned to leave, then paused. And perhaps, if you work well and cause no trouble, I will tell you a story. A story about 3 tanks and the war that time forgot. With that cryptic statement, the general shuffled away, leaving Klaus more confused and intrigued than ever. That night, back at the POW camp, Klaus couldn't sleep. What did Beaumont mean? What story could possibly justify hiding 3 tanks in a barn? The revelation. A week passed before General Beaumont approached Klaus again. The repair work was progressing well. The barn structure had been reinforced, new boards replaced rotten ones, and the roof no longer threatened to collapse. The prisoners had fallen into an efficient rhythm, and Pierre had grown almost friendly, occasionally sharing cigarettes with them during breaks. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Beaumont appeared in the barn doorway, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. He surveyed the work with approval before his gaze settled on Klaus. You, Schneider. Come with me. Klaus exchanged glances with Hans, who shrugged slightly. The French guards didn't intervene as Klaus followed the general out of the barn and toward the manor house. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Had someone reported his curiosity about the tanks? Was he being separated from the others for punishment? But Beaumont led him not to the guards, but to a small study filled with books, maps, and military memorabilia. Photographs lined the walls, showing a younger Beaumont in various uniforms spanning decades. The general gestured to a leather chair and lowered himself into another with a grunt. "Do you know why I asked for German prisoners to repair my barn?" Beaumont asked without preamble. Klaus shook his head, uncertain where this was leading. "Because I needed men who would understand. Men who knew what those machines under the tarps represent." The general poured 2 glasses of cognac from a crystal decanter, sliding one across the desk to Klaus. The gesture was so unexpected that Klaus simply stared at it. "Drink," Beaumont commanded. "This conversation requires it." Klaus sipped the cognac, the burn in his throat a sharp contrast to the prison camp's watery soup. Beaumont leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "I was 23 years old in 1916 at Verdun. Have you heard of Verdun, Schneider?" "Yes, sir. The longest battle of the Great War. 303 days of hell," Beaumont said softly. "Nearly 1,000,000 casualties. The earth itself died there, poisoned by gas and blood. I was a lieutenant then, commanding a company that dwindled to 15 men by the battle's end." He paused, sipping his cognac. "It was at Verdun that I first saw tanks. British Mark is lumbering forward like iron behemoths. Primitive, unreliable, but terrifying." Klaus listened, unsure where this was going, but captivated nonetheless. "I became obsessed with tanks after that. I saw them as the future of warfare, the key to breaking the stalemate. After the war, I helped develop France's armor doctrine. By 1940, I commanded a tank regiment." His expression darkened. "Fat lot of good it did us." "The Battle of France," Klaus said quietly. 6 weeks, Beaumont spat. 6 weeks, and France fell. Not because our tanks were inferior, but because our strategy was obsolete. While you Germans understood mobile warfare, we scattered our armor in support roles, never concentrating our force." He finished his cognac and poured another. "Do you know what it's like, Schneider, to spend 20 years preparing for war, only to lose in 6 weeks?" Klaus thought of the Reich's collapse, of promises of wonder weapons and final victories that never came. "Yes, General, I think I do." Beaumont's eyes met his, and for a moment, they were simply 2 soldiers who had seen their nations defeated. "After France surrendered, I was ordered to turn over all equipment to the Wehrmacht. Most of my tanks went to your army or were scrapped. But 3, he smiled slightly. 3 I couldn't bear to lose." "The tanks in the barn," Klaus breathed. "Renault Charby 1 bis," Beaumont confirmed. "Magnificent machines. 70 tons, 60 millimeters of frontal armor, a 75 millimeter hull gun, and a 47 millimeter turret gun. In the right circumstances, they could destroy any German tank of 1940. Pride filled his voice. "And I hid them." Klaus's mind reeled. "Ow! Money, connections, loyal men. The chaos of defeat provided cover. I reported them destroyed in combat, provided false documentation, and had them transported here in the dead of night. The barn was reinforced specifically to house them." Beaumont leaned forward. "For 5 years, through occupation and liberation, they've remained hidden. Only a handful of people know they exist. Why tell me this?" The general's expression turned serious. "Because they need to be preserved properly. The barn repairs are necessary, but so is maintenance on the tanks themselves. They haven't been started in years. Seals are drying, fuel is degrading, batteries are dead. I'm an old man, Schneider. When I die, these tanks could be lost forever, or worse, discovered and scrapped." He paused. "I need someone who understands their value. Someone who knows machines. You were Panzer Grenadier. You know tanks." The unveiling. The next morning, Klaus arrived at the farm with his heart pounding. General Beaumont had instructed him to tell no one about their conversation, but as Klaus worked alongside Hans and the others, the secret burned inside him like a coal. At mid-morning, Pierre approached Klaus. "The general wants you. Leave your tools." The other prisoners watched with curious expressions as Klaus followed Pierre to the manor house. But instead of going inside, Pierre led him back to the barn, where Beaumont waited beside the covered vehicles. The old general held a flashlight and wore an expression of nervous anticipation that made him look decades younger. "The others are working on the far side," Beaumont said. "We have perhaps an hour before they move to this section. Help me remove the tarps." Together, they untied the ropes and pulled back the canvas coverings. As the first tank emerged from its shroud, Klaus felt his jaw drop despite himself. The Char B-1 bis was magnificent, its hull painted in pre-war French army colors, now faded but still visible. The tank sat on its shreds like a sleeping predator, all angles and armor plate. Beautiful, isn't she? Beaumont ran his hand along the hull with the tenderness of a man touching a beloved horse. This one is named Jeanne d'Arc. The others are Charlemagne and Napoleon. Klaus walked around Jeanne d'Arc slowly, his professional eye assessing the vehicle. The tracks showed signs of age, rust speckling the metal. The vision's slits were thick with dust. The turret gun's breech was visible through the open hatch, but the interior would be dark and likely suffering from 5 years of humidity. "May I?" Klaus gestured to the hull. Beaumont nodded, and Klaus climbed onto the tank, his hands finding familiar holds despite the foreign design. The hatch opened with protest, hinges stiff from disuse. The smell that wafted out was unmistakable to anyone who had served in armored vehicles. Oil, metal, rubber, and the peculiar mustiness of confined spaces. Klaus dropped through the hatch into the driver's compartment. His eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the vision slits. The controls were different from German tanks, but recognizable. Steering levers, pedals, gauges, and switches. Cobwebs draped the radio equipment. The seats were cracked leather, padding emerging from splits in the material. "What do you see?" Beaumont called from outside. Klaus climbed back out, his uniform dusted with 5 years of accumulated grime. "They're salvageable, but there's work to be done. The interiors need cleaning, rubber components need replacing, fluids need changing. The electrical systems will need complete inspection." He paused. With proper tools and materials, they could run again. Beaumont's face lit up. "Truly, yes, but it won't be easy. And it can't be done quickly or obviously. The other prisoners will notice activity around the tanks. The guard might ask questions." The general nodded slowly, thinking, "Then we must be clever. The barn repairs will continue for another 3 weeks. During that time, you will work on reorganizing the barn's interior. Pierre will provide you with cleaning supplies, basic tools. You'll work alone on this section when possible, ostensibly clearing space and arranging storage. And the specialized work? Engine maintenance, fuel systems? I have contacts who can provide parts and materials, but they must be smuggled in carefully. When the other prisoners finish their work and leave, you will remain. I'll arrange it with the camp commandant. One prisoner to complete final details." Beaumont smiled. "He owes me several favors." Klaus understood the magnitude of what was being proposed. "Why trust me with this? I'm your enemy." "Former enemy," Beaumont corrected. "The war is over, Schneider. We're simply 2 old soldiers now, trying to preserve something beautiful from history's garbage heap." He extended his hand. "Will you help me?" Klaus looked at the 3 tanks, monuments to French military engineering and pride. He thought of his own service in the Panzerwaffe, the brotherhood of tank crews, the strange honor among men who fought from steel boxes. He thought of how quickly the world forgot the machines of war once the fighting stopped. He shook Beaumont's hand. "I'll help you." For the next hour, they carefully replaced the tarps, but now Klaus knew every detail beneath them. As he returned to work with the other prisoners, Hans pulled him aside. "What was that about?" Klaus hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. "The general wants me to stay after the main work is done. Clean up, organize things. He's arranged it with the commandant." Hans's eyes narrowed. "Does this have anything to do with what's under those tarps?" "Maybe." "Klaus, be careful. Whatever the old man is hiding, if the authorities find out, I know the risks." Klaus glanced toward where Beaumont stood, watching from the manor house steps. "But some things are worth preserving, Hans, even if they belonged to the other side." Midnight mechanics. 3 weeks later, the main repair work was complete. The barn stood straight and solid, its new boards bright against the weathered old wood. 15 German POWs loaded into trucks and returned to camp, leaving only Klaus behind. The arrangement had caused grumbling among the guards, but General Beaumont's influence had prevailed. Klaus now slept in a small room above the barn, a space that had once housed stable hands. It was sparse but infinitely better than the POW camp, a rail bed, a window overlooking the fields, and most importantly, privacy. Pierre brought him meals from the manor house, and Klaus was permitted to work on his own schedule, though always under the watchful presence of a single French guard who changed shifts every 8 hours. The official story was that Klaus was cataloging the barn's contents and making a final inventory. The reality was far more complex. Working carefully to avoid suspicion, Klaus had spent the first days after the others left doing exactly what he'd claimed: cleaning, organizing, and cataloging. But each night, after the evening guard settled into his routine of smoking and dozing, Klaus would work on the tanks. He started with Jeanne d'Arc, the tank Beaumont loved most. The first task was simply cleaning years of dust and grime from every surface, inside and out. Working by lamplight, Klaus wiped down control panels, cleaned gauges, and removed cobwebs from every crevice. The work was meditative, almost sacred. Each component told a story. Scratch marks from hurried repairs, chalk notations from mechanics long gone, even a faded photograph tucked into the driver's compartment showing a smiling French crew. Beaumont visited nearly every evening, always after dark, always checking first that the guard was inattentive. The old general would sit on a hay bale and talk while Klaus worked, sharing stories of his service. "We called this one Lucky Jean," Beaumont said one night, running his hand along the hull. "She took a direct hit from an 88mm gun at Ston in May 1940. The shell bounced off her frontal armor. Left that scar there, see?" He pointed to a gouge in the thick plate. "Saved the lives of 5 men that day." Klaus examined the scar, recognizing the impact pattern. "You were right to save these. They're historical treasures." "They're more than that," Beaumont said quietly. "They're proof that France fought. When the war is discussed, people remember our surrender, our collaboration, our shame. They forget that French soldiers fought and died by the thousands trying to stop your army. These tanks are evidence of that sacrifice." The emotional weight of the statement hung in the air. Klaus returned to his work, checking the condition of the tank suspension. "The bogies need grease, but the springs look good. The tracks will need tensioning once we get her moving." "Moving?" Beaumont's voice rose with excitement. "You think we can actually start them? With the right parts, yes. The engines are sound, just neglected. We need fresh fuel, new batteries, oil coolant, and someone who knows Renault engines." Klaus climbed out of the driver's hatch. "Do you know such a person?" Beaumont smiled mysteriously. "I may know someone who knows someone. Let me make some inquiries." 2 days later, a truck arrived late at night. Klaus watched from the barn loft as Pierre and another man unloaded crates and barrels, working quickly and quietly. When they finished, Beaumont came to fetch Klaus. "Fuel, oil, batteries, and a surprise," the general announced, pulling back a tarp to reveal a small man in his 60s wearing mechanic's coveralls. "This is Marcel. He worked on Charby 1S during the war. He's agreed to help us." Marcel barely spoke, but his expertise was immediately apparent. He examined each tank with the practiced eye of a master craftsman, making notes in a small leather book. When he finally spoke, it was in rapid French that Klaus couldn't follow. Beaumont translated. "He says all 3 are restorable, but Jeanne d'Arc is in the best condition. We should focus on her first. The engines need complete services, but the major components are intact." Beaumont paused. He wants to know if you can assist him. He needs someone with strong arms and mechanical knowledge. Klaus nodded eagerly. "Yes, of course." For the next 2 weeks, Klaus worked alongside Marcel in a strange partnership bridging language and nationality. Marcel would point and demonstrate. Klaus would follow and learn. They drained old fuel and oil, flushed systems, replaced seals and gaskets. The French guard watched with bored confusion, having been told they were preparing equipment for sale. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Klaus found himself appreciating French engineering in ways he never had during the war. The Charby 1 bis was overbuilt, complex, and incredibly durable. It was also, he had to admit, better armored than most German tanks of its era. Late one night, as they installed a new battery, Marcel spoke to Klaus directly in halting German. "You good soldier?" Klaus paused, surprised. "I try to be." Marcel nodded slowly. "War make enemies. Peace Make friends, yes. He extended his oil-stained hand. Klaus shook it firmly. Yes, friends. The first start. November brought cold rain that drummed on the barn's new roof and turned the fields to mud. Klaus had been at the farm for nearly 2 months now, and the transformation of Jean d'Arc was nearly complete. Every system had been cleaned, repaired, or replaced. Fresh paint covered the rust spots. The treads had been tensioned and greased. All that remained was the moment of truth, starting the engine. General Beaumont arrived early on the chosen morning, accompanied by Marcel and Pierre. Even the French guard sensed something significant was happening and wandered closer to the barn, curiosity overcoming his usual lethargy. "Are you certain she's ready?" Beaumont asked, his voice trembling slightly with excitement or fear. Klaus couldn't tell which. Marcel gave a curt nod. "Ready." Klaus climbed into the driver's compartment, his heart pounding. He'd started dozens of tanks during his service, but never one that had sat silent for 5 years. The controls felt foreign under his hands, but Marcel had drilled him on the procedure. He checked the fuel gauge, full. Battery connections, secure. Oil pressure, good. Contact, Klaus called out, and Marcel engaged the external starter. The engine coughed once, twice. Then nothing. Again, Beaumont urged. Marcel worked the starter once more. This time the engine caught with a roar that shook dust from the rafters. The sound was magnificent, a deep-throated rumble that spoke of power and purpose. Klaus adjusted the throttle, and the engine settled into a steady idle. Vibrations traveled through the hull, making the entire tank come alive. Through the vision slit, Klaus could see Beaumont's face transformed with joy. The old general was laughing and crying simultaneously, one hand pressed against the tank's hull as if feeling its heartbeat. Marcel wore a satisfied smile, nodding his approval at the engine's note. Klaus let her run for several minutes, monitoring gauges and listening for problems. Everything looked good. The oil pressure was steady, temperature rising normally. No unusual sounds beyond the expected mechanical symphony of a 70-ton war machine. "Try the movements," Beaumont called over the engine noise. Klaus engaged the clutch and moved the steering levers experimentally. The left track began to move, then the right. Jean d'Arc shifted slightly, her weight settling differently on the treads. Klaus felt a surge of pride unlike anything he'd experienced since the war's end. He'd helped bring this magnificent machine back to life. After 20 minutes, Marcel signaled to shut down. Klaus killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt almost oppressive. He climbed out to find Beaumont embracing Marcel, both men speaking rapid French with animated gestures. "She runs perfectly." Beaumont turned to Klaus, pulling him into an unexpected embrace. "Thank you, my boy. Thank you. You've given an old man his dreams back." The French guard approached cautiously. "General, what is under that tarp? That doesn't sound like a truck." Beaumont composed himself, his expression becoming serious. "Corporal Durand, what you've witnessed today is a matter of national security. This barn contains historical military equipment that I have preserved for eventual donation to a military museum. You will speak of this to no one. Is that understood?" The guard looked uncertain, but Beaumont's authority carried weight. "Oui, mon general." "Good man. There will be something extra in your pay this month for your discretion." After the guard returned to his post, Beaumont, Marcel, and Klaus stood around Jean d'Arc, admiring their work. The tank looked magnificent, deadly, and graceful simultaneously. "What now?" Klaus asked. "Do we work on the other two?" Marcel nodded vigorously. "Charlemagne next. Napoleon needs more work, maybe 2 months. But first," Beaumont interjected, "we should test Jean properly. Not just idling, but actually driving her." He looked at Klaus. "Have you ever driven a tank, Schneider?" "Only once, when our driver was wounded. I'm not skilled, but I can manage basic movements. Then tomorrow night, when the moon is dark, we'll take her outside. Just a short drive through the fields, nothing dramatic. But she deserves to move freely, even if only once." Klaus felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "That's risky. If someone sees." The nearest neighbor is 3 kilometers away, and the fields are screened by trees. Besides, Beaumont's eyes glittered with mischief. What's the point of bringing a tank back to life if she never moves? That night, Klaus lay awake in his room above the barn, listening to the rain and thinking about tomorrow. He was a German prisoner of war, helping a French general hide tanks from the Allied authorities. The absurdity of it should have troubled him, but instead, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since before the war's end. Below him, in the barn, Jeanne d'Arc waited in silence, her engine ready, her crew of enemies-turned-friends preparing to give her one more mission. A midnight drive through the French countryside, carrying ghosts of battles long past and dreams of preservation for the future. Midnight drive. The night was moonless, exactly as Beaumont had hoped. Klaus stood beside Jeanne d'Arc, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The barn doors were open, revealing darkness beyond. Marcel had spent the afternoon checking every system one final time, and now the tank sat ready, fueled and armed with nothing but memories. "The guard?" Klaus asked. "Pierre has taken Corporal Durand to town," Beaumont replied. "Something about an urgent message for the camp commandant. They won't return for several hours." The general climbed onto the tank with surprising agility for his age, settling into the commander's position in the turret. "I'll direct you from up here. Marcel will ride in the radio operator's seat." Klaus dropped through the driver's hatch, the familiar smell of oil and metal enveloping him. Marcel squeezed into position beside him, carrying a flashlight and toolkit, just in case. The interior was cramped and dark, lit only by the instrument panel's faint glow once Klaus started the engine. The Renault engine roared to life, and Klaus felt its power thrumming through the control levers. He'd studied the tank's operations manual that Beaumont had provided, practicing the motions until they became second nature. Now came the real test. Forward, slowly, Beaumont's voice echoed through the open hatches. Klaus engaged the transmission and fed power to the tracks. Jeanne d'Arc lurched slightly, then began to move. The sensation was both familiar and strange. The Char B1 handled differently than the Panzer IVs Klaus had ridden in during the war. The steering was heavier, the response slower, but the tank moved with ponderous authority. They emerged from the barn into the night, track links clattering on stone before biting into wet earth. Klaus adjusted the throttle, finding the rhythm. Through the vision slits, he could see nothing but darkness, forcing him to rely entirely on Beaumont's directions. "Bear left. There's a good clear path through the north field." The tank turned, one track slowing while the other maintained speed. They were doing perhaps 5 kilometers per hour, barely a crawl, but in the darkness, it felt like flying. The engine's roar filled the night, surely audible for kilometers, but there was no helping that now. "How does she feel?" Beaumont called down. "Strong. The steering is responsive, engine running smoothly." They drove for perhaps 15 minutes, following the field's perimeter. Klaus began to understand why tankers spoke of their vehicles with such affection. Despite being a prisoner, despite all the war's horrors, there was something magnificent about commanding such a machine. The power, the protection, the sense of being part of something larger than oneself. "Stop here," Beaumont ordered. Klaus brought Jeanne d'Arc to a halt in the middle of the field. The engine idled with a contented rumble. Above, through the open hatch, he could hear Beaumont moving in the turret. "Come up here, Schneider. You need to see this." Klaus pulled himself up through the hatch and stood beside Beaumont on the tank's hull. The view took his breath away. The countryside spread before them, dark and peaceful, with only the faint lights of distant farmhouses visible. The war seemed impossibly far away. "My grandfather fought in 1870 against Prussia," Beaumont said quietly. "My father fought in 1914 against Germany. I fought in both wars. 3 generations, always the same enemy." He paused. "But tonight, a German soldier helps me preserve a piece of French military history. Perhaps there's hope yet." Klaus didn't know what to say to that, so he simply stood beside the old general, 2 soldiers sharing a moment of peace on a tank that had never achieved its purpose. "We should head back," Beaumont said finally. "But first, let me show you something." He dropped into the turret and, after a moment, Klaus heard the electric motors whine as the turret began to rotate. It moved smoothly, the restoration work having succeeded beyond their hopes. The guns, Marcel called up excitedly, pointing. Beaumont traversed the turret through a full 360-degree rotation, then elevated the main gun toward the sky. Perfect. Everything works perfectly. His voice was thick with emotion. The return journey to the barn was slower, Klaus now more confident with the controls. He executed turns with greater precision, adjusted speed smoothly, even backed the tank up a short distance to practice. By the time Jeanne d'Arc rolled back into the barn, Klaus felt he could claim to be a proper Char B1 driver. They shut down the engine and sat in the sudden silence, all three men grinning like schoolboys who'd gotten away with some grand prank. In a sense, they had. They'd stolen a few hours with a machine that officially didn't exist, driven her through fields under cover of darkness, and proven that the months of work had been worthwhile. Now we do the same for Charlemagne and Napoleon, Beaumont declared. And then, someday, when the time is right, the world will learn that these three ladies survived. Not as weapons, but as monuments to the men who built them, crewed them, and died in them. Klaus climbed out of the tank, his clothes soaked with sweat despite the cold night. What happens when they're all restored? The authorities will eventually find out. By then, I'll be dead probably, Beaumont said matter-of-factly. But I'm working on arrangements. There are museum directors who know me, historians who understand the value of preservation. When I'm gone, Pierre has instructions. The tanks will be donated properly, with documentation of their history. He smiled, including the part about a German POW who helped save them. Legacy. Spring came to the French countryside with a riot of color. The fields around Beaumont's estate burst into bloom, and Klaus watched from the barn as nature erased the last visible scars of war. It was April 1946, and his work on the three tanks was nearly complete. Charlemagne had roared to life 2 months after Jeanne d'Arc, and just last week, Napoleon had joined her sisters. All three tanks now sat in the barn, maintained and ready, their preservation ensured by months of careful labor. Klaus had learned more about French tank engineering than most German tankers ever knew, and in the process, he'd found something he thought the war had destroyed: purpose. But all things must end. Pierre arrived at the barn one morning with news that Klaus had been both expecting and dreading. The commandant says you must return to camp next week. Your work here is finished, and other prisoners are being repatriated to Germany. Klaus nodded slowly. I understand. That evening, General Beaumont called Klaus to the manor house study where their strange partnership had begun. The old general poured cognac into 2 glasses, a ritual that had become familiar over the past months. I've received permission for you to be released, Beaumont said without preamble. You'll be repatriated to Germany with the others, free to return home. Home. Klaus tested the word. He wasn't even sure where home was anymore. His family's house in Hamburg had been destroyed in the bombing. His parents were dead. The Germany he'd left in 1939 no longer existed. What will you do? Beaumont asked. I don't know. Find work, rebuild. The same as millions of others. Klaus sipped his cognac. And you? What happens now with the tanks? Beaumont pulled out a document from his desk drawer. I've been in contact with the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. The director, an old friend, has agreed to accept the tanks when the time is right. Not now. It's too soon, too complicated. But in 5 years, perhaps 10, when the world has moved on from the war's immediate aftermath. He handed Klaus a letter. This is for you. A reference, should you need it. It explains your work here, your expertise, your character. Klaus read the letter, written in formal French and signed by General Auguste Beaumont. It praised Klaus's mechanical skills, work ethic, and character. It made no mention of his German nationality or POW status. Why do all this for me? Klaus asked. I'm just a former enemy soldier. Because you understood, Beaumont said simply. When I showed you those tanks, you didn't see enemy equipment or spoils of war. You saw machines worthy of preservation, history worth saving. That understanding transcends nationality. He raised his glass. To preservation, Schneider. Of tanks, of history, and of the better parts of ourselves. They drank, and Klaus felt the weight of the past months settling into memory. This barn, these tanks, this unlikely friendship, it would stay with him forever. The next few days passed in a blur of final preparations. Klaus went over every detail with Marcel, ensuring the maintenance schedules were documented, the parts list complete, the procedures clear. Marcel's German had improved, and Klaus's French was now passable. They'd become a team, and saying goodbye was harder than Klaus had expected. On his final evening, Beaumont insisted on one last ceremony. They gathered in the barn at sunset. Beaumont, Marcel, Pierre, and Klaus. The three tanks sat in a row, their hulls gleaming from fresh wax, their canvas covers folded nearby. "When I die," Beaumont began, his voice formal, "these tanks will pass to the museum. But tonight, before you leave us, Schneider, I want you to know that you are part of their story. Your name will be recorded in their documentation. Future historians will know that a German soldier helped preserve these French tanks." He extended a small box to Klaus. "This was my commander's insignia from the Great War. I want you to have it." Klaus opened the box to find a small bronze pin showing crossed swords beneath a tank silhouette. His throat tightened with emotion. "General, I can't. You can, and you will. When you wear it, remember that the best of military service isn't killing the enemy, but recognizing when the killing must stop and the building must begin." They shook hands, then embraced. Marcel did the same, pressing a small package into Klaus's hands, photographs of the restoration work they'd completed together. The next morning, Klaus left the farm in a military truck, watching through the rear as the barn grew smaller, eventually disappearing behind a hill. He carried with him the general's letter, Marcel's photographs, and the bronze pin. He also carried something less tangible but more valuable: the knowledge that even in the aftermath of hatred and destruction, men could choose preservation over vengeance, memory over forgetting. Klaus Schneider returned to Germany, where he eventually opened a small garage specializing in vehicle restoration. He never spoke publicly about the 3 French tanks hidden in a barn, but he told his children and grandchildren, making them promise to remember. In 1952, he received a letter from Paris informing him that General Auguste Beaumont had passed away. The letter included an invitation to attend a ceremony at the Musée de l'Armée, where 3 Charby 1 bis tanks would be unveiled as part of the permanent collection. Klaus made the journey to Paris, standing anonymously in the crowd as the tanks he'd helped preserve were revealed to the public. The plaques mentioned General Beaumont's name and his role in saving the tanks. They mentioned Marcel, the mechanic who'd helped restore them. And in small letters at the bottom, they mentioned K. Schneider, assistant restorer, 1945 to 1946. No one knew who K. Schneider was, and Klaus never identified himself. But he stood there, tears streaming down his face, as Jeanne d'Arc, Charlemagne, and Napoleon took their places in history. Not as weapons of war, but as monuments to the men who'd built them and the men who'd ensured they survived. Sometimes, preservation required more courage than destruction. Sometimes, the strongest armor was the ability to recognize humanity in former enemies. And sometimes, the greatest battles were fought not with guns and tanks, but with wrenches and hope, in a barn in the French countryside, where old soldiers remembered how to be simply men.